The storm that knocked. The rain had not asked permission before it arrived, and it showed no intention of leaving. It had been falling since Monday, a slow, relentless drumming that turned the gravel road into a shallow river and pressed the pine trees down into hunched, dark shapes against the gray sky. By Wednesday evening, the world beyond the cabin windows had reduced itself to a single unbroken sound. Water against wood, water against glass, water finding every gap and crease in the earth and filling it without mercy. The kind of rain that didn't feel like weather so much as a verdict. Elias Crane sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and did not notice. He was looking at the grain of the wood, a habit he had developed since becoming a carpenter, this particular way of seeing surfaces, reading the story a tree had written in rings and knots and long flowing lines before someone cut it down and shaped it into something useful. The table had been made by his own hands 3 years ago before things changed. Back when he had made things for reasons beyond the need to simply be doing something with his hands. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that most county maps forgot to include. This was not an accident. When Elias had found the property 2 years ago, he had not been looking for charm or convenience or good resale value. He had been looking for somewhere that would not require him to perform being fine for an audience. The ridge behind the cabin kept the worst of the north wind off the roof. The pines kept the nearest neighbor's lights out of his window. The road discouraged casual visitors. These had been the selling points, and they had delivered on every promise. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a man who expected knocking. So when it came 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the front door, firm enough to be heard clearly over the rain, he sat very still for a moment, certain he had imagined it. His mind offered several sensible explanations. A branch, a shutter he hadn't properly latched, the settling of old wood in the wet. Then it came again, 3 knocks, patient, unhurried. Elias set down the cold mug and pushed back from the table. He pulled on his boots without lacing them, crossed the main room in the dark. He hadn't bothered with the overhead light, only the small lamp on the kitchen counter, and stood at the door with his hand on the knob for just a moment before he opened it. The porch light was on. He always left it on for no particular reason he had ever examined. 2 women stood in the yellow circle of that light, and the rain came down around them like a curtain. His first impression was of height. They were tall in a way that registered before anything else. Not unnaturally so, not the kind of tall that belonged to basketball players or stage actors, but the kind that suggested a different proportion entirely, a frame built to a slightly different specification than the human standard. They were both soaked through. The older one's dark hair was plastered flat against her skull and shoulders. The younger one had her face tilted slightly down, water running off the end of her nose, arms wrapped around herself in the universal posture of someone who has been cold for a very long time. Then the porch light caught the older one's temple, and Elias saw the scales. They ran in a narrow line from just below her left ear to the corner of her jaw, dark and iridescent, like the inside of an abalone shell, shifting between green and copper and something that didn't have a name in any human color vocabulary. The backs of her hands were the same, and he could see now, looking more carefully, that what he'd taken for an unusual texture on the younger one's forearms was the same phenomenon, smaller scales, paler, arranged in elegant overlapping rows the color of old pewter. And then the older one's eyes met his. They were amber, not brown with amber tones, amber, pure and deep, with a faint vertical quality to the pupil that widened in the porch light the way a cat's eye widened, the way something designed for darkness widened when given a reason to look carefully. Elias Crane stood in his doorway in unlaced boots and looked at 2 dragons standing in the rain on his porch, and he experienced a brief, almost philosophical moment of reckoning with everything he thought he had known about the world. Then he looked at the younger one again, at the red rim around her pale green eyes, at the way her jaw was set, the determined clench of someone trying very hard not to show that they were at the edge of something, and the philosophical moment ended. "I apologize for this intrusion." The older one's voice was carefully measured, precise. The kind of voice that had chosen every word before speaking it. Her accent was something he couldn't place, slightly formal, slightly archaic, like someone who had learned the language from very old books and spoken it mostly to themselves. "We have been walking for 2 days, we saw your light." Elias looked at them. He looked at the porch, at the rain beyond it, at the road behind them disappearing into dark and water. He looked at the younger one, whose shivering had graduated from fine tremors to something more visible, more urgent. He stepped aside and held the door open. "There's soup on the stove," he said, "and dry towels in the hall closet, first door on your left." They were careful coming in the way of people who had been made to feel that their presence was too much in too many places, careful with their footsteps, careful not to brush against anything, folding themselves into the space offered as neatly as possible without being asked. The older one stopped on the mat inside the door and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read yet. "You should know what we are," she said. "I think I have an idea," Elias said, Towel's first door on the left. She looked at him for another moment. Then she guided her sister down the hall, and Elias went to the kitchen and turned the burner back on under the soup. He stood at the stove and ladled soup into 2 bowls and tried to have some kind of coherent internal response to the last 3 minutes. The honest result of this effort was, well, they needed to come in out of the rain, which was not a profound conclusion, but it was the one his mind kept returning to when he pushed everything else away. Whatever they were, the younger one had been shaking, and she had red eyes from crying, and it had been 2 days since they'd had shelter. The rest could arrange itself in whatever order it needed to. He put bread on a plate and found the butter and set the table for 2, and by the time the sisters returned, wearing dry towels around their shoulders like capes, their wet clothes presumably draped somewhere in the hallway, the kitchen looked the way it was supposed to look when people were going to sit down and eat. The older one stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the table. Something moved briefly across her face, there and gone, like a cloud shadow across water, and then she composed herself again and sat down where he gestured. The younger one sat beside her without a word and wrapped both hands around the bowl. "Sirha," the older one said after a moment and touched her own sternum lightly, then she touched the younger one's shoulder. "Veil." "Elias," he said, and sat down across from them with his reheated coffee. He watched them eat without making it obvious he was watching. Sirha ate with control, measured spoonfuls, back straight, eyes occasionally flicking up to track the room in a way that looked less like suspicion and more like old habit, the kind of vigilance that had been trained in and never quite trained out. Vale ate the way someone ate when they had decided that dignity could wait and warmth could not, steadily, gratefully, her shoulders dropping incrementally with each minute that passed. When both bowls were empty, Elias refilled them without asking. Neither of them said anything, but Sirha's amber eyes followed him from the stove back to the table with that same unreadable quality, and he got the sense that she was recalibrating something. He put on more water for tea and sat back down. "Do you want to tell me?" he said, not pressing, just opening a door. Sirha folded her hands on the table. She looked at them for a moment, then looked at him, and she told him. She told it plainly, without embellishment, in the same precise way she had spoken since the moment he'd opened the door. As though she had decided that clarity was a form of respect, and she would offer him that much. They were from the mountain range to the north, the Varath Reach she called it, a name that landed in Elias' ears as something old and specific, a name that had been spoken for a very long time over a very particular piece of geography. Their clan had occupied the high ridges there for generations. Not a large clan, she said, and not a prominent one. She used the word lineage in a way that made clear it carried weight she was deliberately setting aside, but a clan nonetheless with a history and a place. The coalition of elders had changed that calculation in early autumn. She described it without drama, which somehow made it worse. A gathering had been called, a decree had been issued. The mountain territories were to be consolidated under the management of the elder families and certain members of certain lesser lineages. She said lesser with the flat precision of someone quoting someone else's word, not endorsing it, were determined to be surplus to requirements. A resource consideration, Sirha said. Not enough to contribute at a level that justified the space they occupied. Elias listened to this and felt something quiet and cold settle in his chest. The decree had been delivered to them, to Sirha and Vale specifically, as the only 2 remaining members of their immediate family, by a pair of formal intermediaries who had walked them to the clan's territorial border over the course of a single afternoon. They had been given 3 days of provisions, and the clear understanding that return would constitute a violation with consequences. Then the intermediaries had gone back up the mountain, and Sirha and Vale had stood at the border with 3 days of food and the sky overhead and whatever direction they chose to walk in. They had walked south. For 2 days they had walked south through the rain, through the dark and the wet and the particular silence of an autumn forest that did not care about anyone's problems. They had slept under a rock overhang the first night, huddled together. They had kept walking the second day. And then through the trees they had seen the small, steady glow of his porch light at the end of a road that most maps forgot to include, and Sirha had made a decision. She finished the account and folded her hands again and waited. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. The rain kept its conversation with the roof. Elias looked at Sirha, who was watching him with those amber eyes that showed nothing except patience and a kind of contained wariness. The look of someone who had learned that the kindness of strangers was a temporary weather pattern and was waiting to see when it would change. Then he looked at Vale, who had her gaze fixed on the middle distance above her mug, her jaw working slightly as though she were chewing on something she'd decided not to say. She was young, not a child. He understood that dragon years mapped differently, that the scale of their lives did not correspond to human counting in any simple way, but young in the way that mattered, young in the way that meant she hadn't yet built up enough scar tissue to take something like this without flinching. Someone had looked at her and decided she was surplus. She had been walked to a border in the rain. She was sitting in a stranger's kitchen in a borrowed towel, and she was holding herself together with both hands. Elias drank his coffee, set the mug down. "You can stay in the spare room," he said, "both of you, until you figure out what comes next." Sirha did not immediately respond. He could see her processing it, the offer arriving in some internal triage system that checked it for angles, for conditions, for the thing underneath the thing. "You do not know us," she said. "No," he agreed. "We are dragons. I noticed." A pause. "That does not concern you." It was not entirely a question. She was nodding. He thought that he had not reacted the way most people apparently reacted. He considered how to explain himself and decided that he didn't have enough information yet to explain himself particularly well, so he settled for honesty instead. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't surprise me," he said. "It does, but you're cold, you haven't eaten since I can only guess when, and it's still raining hard enough that I wouldn't put a dog out in it." He picked up his mug again. "Whatever concerns I have can stand to wait for morning." Sirha looked at him for a long time. He met it without difficulty. He had spent 2 years living alone with his own silences, and he was not frightened of being looked at steadily. What he saw in her face, past the careful composure, was not hostility or calculation, but something more tired and more private. The exhaustion of someone who had been holding everything together through sheer force of will, and was encountering, for the first time in several days, the unexpected problem of not having to. Under the table, her hand moved. He didn't see it directly, but he saw the slight shift in Vale's posture, the small release of tension in her shoulders, and understood that Sirha had found her sister's hand and held it briefly. The smallest thing, an almost invisible thing. It lodged somewhere in Elia's chest like a splinter, quiet and precise. "The spare room has 2 beds," he said. "The sheets are clean. There are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the right one if you get cold." He showed them the room and said good night and went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while and listened to the rain and thought about very little with great focus. This was a skill he had developed over 2 years, the ability to hold his mind at a specific volume, neither too loud nor too quiet, keeping thoughts present without letting them run. It was not peace exactly, but it was functional. He thought about what Sirha had described, the way she had said lesser lineage, not with bitterness exactly, but with the careful neutrality of someone who had been told that particular story so many times it had become structural, foundational, and she had not yet had the distance or the reason to question whether it was true. He thought about the 2 days of walking in the rain. He thought about an elder clan looking at 2 young women and performing the arithmetic of worth, and coming up with a number that justified leaving them at a border with 3 days of food. He thought about all the ways the world had systems for deciding who was worth keeping. He thought about his wife briefly. He always thought about her briefly these days, not because he had stopped loving her, but because the long thoughts were still too heavy, and he had gotten good at keeping them short, keeping them manageable, setting them down before they pulled too hard. He thought about her for just a moment and then set the thought down, gently the way you set down something fragile, and let the rain refill the silence. Down the hall behind the spare room door he heard nothing. No voices, no movement. Just the rain, and after a little while, the deep settled quiet of people who had been exhausted for days and had finally found somewhere to put it down. He was asleep not long after. In the morning, the rain had thinned to a gray drizzle, and pale light came through the kitchen windows at an angle that fell directly across the table. Elias came downstairs in his socks to find Vale already there. She was sitting in the chair beside the window with her knees drawn up, her wet clothes from the night before hanging neatly on the backs of 2 chairs to dry. She had found, apparently without asking, his spare flannel shirt, the old green one that hung on the hook by the back door and had been there long enough to count as furniture, and she had it draped over her shoulders like an additional layer. In her hands was a paperback from the shelf near the fireplace, one of his, and she was reading with the quality of total absorption, the kind that meant the external world had largely ceased to exist. She looked up when he entered, pale green eyes much calmer than the night before. Not entirely calm, there was still something careful in them, still something holding itself at a slight distance, but calmer. The red rim was gone. "I took a book," she said. "I should have asked." "It's fine," he said. "I also took the shirt." "That's fine too." She looked at him for a moment, as if checking whether fine was the operative word or a courtesy covering something else. Then she looked back down at the book. "It's very good," she said. "The author doesn't explain things, he just shows them and trusts you to understand." "That's a good quality in a person too," Elias said, and went to start the coffee. Sirha appeared 20 minutes later, while the coffee was brewing and Elias was making eggs. She stood in the kitchen doorway in the same composed posture as the night before and looked at the pan on the stove and then at him. "Sit down," he said, "it's almost ready." She sat, she folded her hands on the table. She looked out the window at the drizzle and the pale sky and the dark pines standing in rows beyond the glass, and her expression was the expression of someone taking a careful accounting of an unexpected situation. Vale came to the table when called, still carrying the book, and set it face down beside her plate in the self-conscious way of someone who knows they should probably put it away, but cannot quite bring themselves to do it. Ilya served the eggs and sat down across from them and poured 3 cups of coffee. The meal was quiet in the way that first meals in new circumstances are always quiet, an arrangement being figured out, a set of distances being measured, everyone working out how much space they needed and how much they were allowed to take. But it was not uncomfortable. The food was warm, the coffee was strong, the drizzle tapped gently at the glass. At some point, without any particular fanfare, Vale turned a page. At some point, without any particular signal, Sirha reached for the second piece of toast. Ilias drank his coffee and looked at the grain of the table and thought that this was, anyway, a beginning. Outside, the pines stood patient and dark and very still, waiting for the rain to finish. It was not finished yet, but it was lighter than it had been. And somewhere in the east, behind the overcast, the morning was doing what mornings do, pressing quietly forward, making room, insisting in its unhurried way on continuing. The weight of quiet things. The spare room had 2 windows. Ilias had never paid them particular attention before they faced east, which meant morning light, which meant nothing to a man who had been using the spare room as storage for the better part of 2 years, stacking it with boxes that contained things he wasn't ready to deal with, and tools he wasn't currently using, and the general accumulated material of a life that had changed shape without warning. He had cleared it out the morning after the sisters arrived, before either of them had woken, carrying boxes quietly to the workshop and sliding them onto shelves without looking at what was in them. It had taken 40 minutes. He had not thought about the windows until the 3rd morning, when he came downstairs to find Vale sitting on the kitchen floor, not the chair, the floor, with her back against the cabinet and her legs stretched out, reading in a band of early sunlight that had come through the east windows, traveled down the hall and arrived at her exact position with the precision of something deliberate. She had rearranged herself to follow it, he realized, the way a plant did, without thinking about it, without making a decision. He stepped over her legs to get to the coffee maker. "Morning," he said. Ma, she said, which he was already learning, was Vale's most efficient form of greeting before she'd had tea. This was the texture of it, not dramatic, not momentous. The accumulation of small adjustments and small accommodations that happened when people shared a space, the learning of schedules and preferences, the mapping of habits, the gradual resolution of a stranger's outline into something more specific and more known. Elias had forgotten this was how it worked. He had been alone long enough that the architecture of solitude had come to feel like the only architecture. And now there were 2 additional people in it, finding the angles where the light came in. He had expected them to stay a week, maybe 2. He told himself, without examining the statement too closely, that a week or 2 was a reasonable amount of time for 2 people in an unexpected situation to stabilize and form a plan. They stayed through the autumn. It happened without a formal decision being made, which was perhaps the only way it could have happened. If Sirha had sat him down at the kitchen table and outlined the terms of an extended arrangement, if there had been a conversation with clear parameters and mutually agreed upon conditions, Elias might have had the opportunity to talk himself out of it. He was good at talking himself out of things. He had developed that particular skill extensively over the past 2 years, had gotten quite expert at the internal negotiation that resulted in it's easier not to. But Sirha did not operate that way. She made decisions the way she did everything else, practically, and without unnecessary ceremony, and the decision she made at some point in the first week was simply that this was where they were, and therefore things needed to work, and therefore she would make them work. On the 4th day, she cooked dinner. Not asked, not suggested. She simply appeared in the kitchen at 5 in the afternoon and took quiet, methodical inventory of the cabinets and the refrigerator. And by the time Elias came in from the workshop with sawdust in his hair and the particular tiredness of a day spent on detailed work, there was food on the table. Real food, the kind of food that suggested actual intent had been applied to the problem of nourishment. Something with herbs from the small window box he'd neglected for a season, something that smelled like it understood what it was supposed to be. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his work coat and looked at the table and experienced a feeling he didn't have immediate words for. Something between surprise and something older and quieter that he didn't look at directly. "Sit down," Sirha said, without turning from the stove. "You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal since the previous administration." "I eat," he said. You drink coffee and occasionally remember that bread exists, she said. Sit down. He sat down. It became, without further discussion, simply the way things were. Sirha cooked. She did it with the same focused precision she brought to everything, a complete and serious attention, as though a meal were a problem to be solved correctly rather than a chore to be discharged, and the results were remarkable in a way that went beyond technique. There was intention in it. The food felt considered. It felt like someone had thought about what you might need and then provided it, which was, Elias was beginning to understand, Sirha's primary mode of expressing things she didn't say out loud. In exchange, though she would have rejected the word exchange as too transactional for something she'd simply decided to do, he kept the wood stove running through the cold nights. Because dragons, it turned out, ran warmer than humans but were not impervious to the deep chill of a mountain autumn, and Vale in particular curled up near any heat source with the frank appreciation of a creature that had opinions about temperature. He learned to check the wood box in the evenings. He learned to bank the fire before bed so the cabin would hold its warmth through the night. He learned to buy twice as much tea. Vale burned through his shelf of paperbacks in 11 days. He had perhaps 30 books, a modest collection built over years of keeping one on the nightstand and occasionally forgetting to return things borrowed from others, and she read them with a thoroughness and a speed that suggested she was not skimming. She was reading, completely. She retained everything, and she had opinions about all of it, and she expressed these opinions aloud to the general air of whatever room she happened to be in the manner of someone who had spent a long time with thoughts and not enough people to give them to. He started calling the town library on Fridays. The librarian, a woman named Ruth who had been running the branch for longer than Elias had lived in the county, and who approached her work with the seriousness of someone guarding something important, adapted quickly to the new pattern of a bag of returns and a list of requests appearing on the counter each week. She asked no questions about who was doing this much reading. Librarians, Elias had always felt, understood that the appetite for books was not something that required explanation. Vale worked through histories and novels and natural philosophy and atlases and collections of folk stories from cultures she had never encountered, and she read with the same expression throughout, this quality of bright, focused hunger, like someone who had been waiting a long time to be fed a specific thing and was now making up for lost time. She would read in the armchair by the window, or on the floor in the band of morning light, or curled at one end of the couch with her legs tucked under her, in a way that suggested that furniture was a suggestion she found occasionally useful. She read passages aloud when they got to her, not to anyone in particular, or rather to the room, to the air, to whoever happened to be in range of the thought she wanted to share. She would read a sentence or a paragraph in that particular voice people use when something has been so well said that it feels wasteful to keep it to yourself, and then she would look up briefly to see if it had landed, and if it had, something bright moved through her expression and was gone. Elias found, to his own mild surprise, that he looked forward to these moments. He had been a quiet man before, and the accident and the grief had made him quieter still, had compressed his world down to the dimensions of the workshop and the cabin and the road between them, had made conversation feel like something that happened to other people in the general roar of a life he'd stepped out of. He had not missed it, or he had told himself he had not missed it, which amounted to the same thing as long as you didn't examine it too carefully. But Vale's voice in the next room, reading something she'd found extraordinary, that was a different thing. That was not the weight of social obligation or the effort of performed engagement. That was just someone being alive nearby and finding things worth noticing and saying so. It turned out he had missed that very much. Sirha watched him in the way she watched everything, steadily and without making it obvious, and with the patience of someone who understood that the truest information about a person came from the unguarded moments rather than the presented ones. She watched him in the mornings, when he stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked out at the pines with an expression she was learning to read, the particular set of his jaw, the quality of stillness that was different from ordinary stillness, the way his eyes tracked something that was not in the yard. She watched him in the evenings when he came in from the workshop and sat at the table and sometimes forgot what he'd come in to do. She watched the way he moved through the cabin, careful, contained, leaving the minimum possible footprint, a man who had been living as though he was trying not to take up too much room in his own house. She recognized it, not from personal experience, grief had not visited her in quite that form, but from having watched her mother in the years after her father's death, had watched the careful economy of a person who had lost the one they'd built their life around and was now trying to figure out the structural implications. The architecture of a shared life, suddenly load-bearing in ways it hadn't been before. She did not say anything about it. It was not her place to say anything about it, and even if it had been, she wasn't sure she had the right language. Dragon customs around grief were different, more communal, more prescribed, with formal periods and formal endings, and the expectation that loss would be processed according to a structure that told you where you were in it. She had the sense that Elias had not been given a structure, or had been given one that didn't fit, and had been navigating without a map for longer than was good for him. What she could do was practical. She was good at practical. She cooked meals that were warm and specific, not generous in an overwhelming way, but calibrated, as though she had noticed what he responded to and provided that. She kept the kitchen clean and the wood stove managed and the small details of the household running, because she had noticed that when the details ran themselves, he seemed lighter, seemed to have more room for whatever he was quietly working on inside himself. She didn't draw attention to any of this. She simply did it because it needed doing and because she was there. Vale, who was less subtle than her sister in most respects and had no intention of becoming more so, simply talked to him. About whatever she was reading. About the things she thought about questions that had occurred to her and had no particular answer and might benefit from being said out loud to someone who might have a perspective. She talked to him the way she would have talked to a member of her own family, which was to say without excessive formality and with the assumption that he was interested, because she had decided he was worth being interested in. He always was. He listened well. He responded without performing it, not nodding along with the effortful attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but actually thinking about what had been said, actually engaging with the idea, sometimes offering a counterthought or a question that opened something up further. Vale had not had many people in her life who listened like that. She found she saved things up for him. Little observations, small confusions, questions she encountered in her reading. She brought them to him the way you brought things to a person who would know what to do with them. He usually did. The first time he laughed, it was a Thursday evening in the second week of October. The details were these. Vale had finished a mystery novel that afternoon, a long one she'd been working through for 3 days, and she had come to the last chapter with a building sense of satisfaction and a strong theory about the ending, and the ending had been something else entirely. Something she considered not merely unexpected but actively wrong. A decision by the author that she found philosophically indefensible and personally disrespectful to the preceding 400 pages. She had come into the kitchen to say so. She said so at some length. She stood near the counter and she laid out her argument with genuine precision, the evidence she had assembled, the logic of it, the narrative justice that the ending had failed to deliver, the specific nature of the betrayal, and the argument was good. It was coherent and well-structured and made several points that Elias, who had read the book several years ago and had a vaguer memory of it, thought were actually quite fair. But it was also delivered with an intensity of feeling that was disproportionate to the stakes in a way that was becoming, as she went on, increasingly difficult to take entirely seriously with a straight face. She had reached the part of the argument where she was illustrating with her hands the structural flaw in the final act. Her hands spread wide to indicate the magnitude of the missed opportunity, the sheer scope of what the author had declined to do, and she was very committed to the gesture. And she had not quite tracked how close her left hand had gotten to the large jar of flour sitting on the counter beside her. The jar went sideways. It did not break. It hit the kitchen floor and the lid came off, and the flour, an entire 2-pound jar of it, detonated outward in a white cloud that moved faster and farther than physics seemed entirely to require. It reached Vale first because she was closest. It reached Elias a half-second later. It reached Sirha in the doorway an instant after that because the cloud was generous and did not play favorites. The kitchen went white. There was a silence of perhaps 3 full seconds. Then Vale looked down at her arms, which were coated. She looked up at Elias, whose face was wearing the flour like a mask, whose eyebrows had gone entirely white, who stood at the counter with a coffee cup in his hand and an expression of pure baffled suspension, caught between the reality that had existed 3 seconds ago and the one that existed now. A sound escaped her. She tried to contain it and couldn't. It came out through her nose first, then her mouth, and it was absolutely a giggle, high and involuntary and immediately mortified, because she was 22 years old and had been trying very hard to make a serious point and had instead committed flour. And Elias Crane laughed. It started in his chest and it came up without permission. The way things come up when they haven't been used in a long time and suddenly find a way out, unstuck by something unexpected. It was a little rough at first, a little unpracticed, like an engine catching after a cold start. But then it found its stride, and it was real, and it was not the polite minimal laugh of social obligation but actual laughter, the kind that takes over, the kind that makes a person set down their coffee cup because they need their hands free. He laughed. Sirha stood in the doorway covered in flour and she watched him laugh and she did not move for a moment. She watched it happen with the careful attention she brought to things that mattered. She had been observing this man for 2 weeks, had been reading him, cataloging his expressions, learning the geography of his silences, and she had not seen this. had not seen him go unguarded in this particular direction, had not seen the lines of his face do what they did now, which was to rearrange themselves into something that looked like the person he might have been before whatever had made him so careful. Something loosened in her own chest, slowly, the way something loosens that has been wound tight for a long time and finds without warning that the reason for the tension has briefly lifted. He recovered. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at Vale, still mid-giggle and now trying to compose herself and mostly failing. "That was a very good argument," he said, "right up until the flower." "I stand by the argument," Vale said, with as much dignity as a person covered in flour could manage, which was some but not a great deal. They cleaned the kitchen together, the three of them, and it took longer than it should have because the flower had achieved remarkable coverage and also because Vale continued making her case throughout and Elias continued responding to it and neither of them was entirely focused on the sweeping. Sirha swept with efficiency and said nothing, but at some point quietly when neither of them was watching she smiled. A small one, private, gone almost before it was there. But there, autumn deepened around them the way it does in the mountains, not gradually exactly, but in layers, each week peeling back another degree of warmth, trading green for gold and gold for copper and copper for bare gray branch. The pines kept their dark color and their patience. The mornings acquired frost on the kitchen windows that Elias scraped away with an old credit card he kept on the sill for the purpose. The cabin adapted to 3 people in it the way old wood adapts to new weather, with a certain amount of protest, then a certain amount of settling, and then a quiet that felt less like absence and more like structure. Sirha began going with him to the valley on his supply runs. At first simply because she needed things that couldn't be ordered from the library and had no other way to get them. And then, because she turned out to be extraordinarily good at the practical logistics of getting a vehicle loaded efficiently and negotiating prices at the lumber supplier with a composure that most people found subtly difficult to argue with. The supplier, a large and opinionated man named Garrett who had been charging Elias the same mildly inflated rate for 3 years out of sheer habit, suddenly found himself offering a discount without entirely understanding how the conversation had arrived there. Elias said nothing about this on the drive home. After a mile, he glanced sideways at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "He was charging you 16% over the regional standard," she said, looking out the window. "I noticed it the first time and confirmed it the second." "When did you look up the regional standard?" "Tuesday." He looked back at the road. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once as though the matter was simply concluded, and watched the pines go by. On a night in late October, Elias was in the workshop after dinner, finishing a cabinet door that needed another coat of finish and wouldn't be improved by rushing. The light in the workshop was good, he'd strung extra bulbs years ago, and the smell of the finish and the wood and the particular cold outside warmth inside quality of the air made the work feel manageable, made the late hour feel like a reasonable choice rather than avoidance. He heard the workshop door open and close. He didn't look up, he knew the footstep. Vale climbed onto the workbench beside the window, not the stool he kept there for exactly this purpose, but the bench itself, sitting cross-legged and utterly unconcerned about this decision, and opened her book under the hanging lamp. She read for a while, he worked. The finish went on smooth and even, and the wood came up the way good wood came up when you treated it with the right amount of patience. "This one," Vale said after a while, "is about a woman who builds a lighthouse on a coastline where everyone told her a lighthouse was unnecessary." "Is it necessary?" Elias asked, not looking up. "Of course it's necessary," Vale said. "That's not really the point, though." She turned a page. "The point is that she built it anyway, and then ships started coming that hadn't come before because there was a light." He drew the brush across the grain, slow and even. "Good book," he said. "Getting there," she said. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. The workshop was warm. The wood was good. On the bench beside the window, Vale read, and the lamplight made a small and sufficient world of the space they occupied, and Elias Crane worked, and the night was long and quiet and entirely bearable. He did not note the moment as significant. It simply was what it was, a man in his workshop and a young woman reading, and the easy silence of people who have stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. But somewhere in the back of his chest, without announcement, something that had been very still for a very long time shifted slightly. "Made room." What was given back? November arrived the way it always did in the mountains, not with the dramatic flourish of a season making an entrance, but with a slow and serious accumulation of intention. The light changed first. It went from the warm amber slant of late October to something cooler and more horizontal, arriving at lower angles and departing earlier each day, as though the sun had somewhere else to be and was increasingly firm about keeping to its schedule. Then the temperature dropped in earnest, not the manageable chill of autumn that yielded to afternoon sun, but the deep and committed cold that moved into the bones of things and stayed there. The ground hardened. The last of the leaves came down. The pines turned from dark green to something closer to black against the pale sky, and the mountain ridge behind the cabin became a clean and serious line that meant business. Elias had always liked November. He could not have explained this to everyone's satisfaction since November was not a month that inspired uncomplicated affection in most people. But there was something in its honesty that appealed to him, the way it stripped everything back, removed the softening elements, left the essential structure visible. You could see the shape of things in November, the bones of the hillside, the architecture of the trees. He had always found truth easier to look at when the decorative elements had been removed. He was thinking none of this on the Tuesday morning when the clan representative arrived. He was in the workshop, fitting a drawer assembly that had been giving him difficulty, a tolerance issue, fractions of a millimeter, the kind of problem that required complete attention and rewarded patience and punished any attempt to force a solution. He was deep in the specific focus that fine work required, the state where the rest of the world receded, and there was only the wood and the fit and the small adjustments of hand and eye. He did not hear the car on the road. He did not hear the knock at the front door. He heard eventually footsteps on the workshop's gravel path, a single set, deliberate and slow. And then the shadow of Sirha fell across the open doorway and he looked up. He knew immediately that something had happened, not from her expression, which was composed with its usual completeness, not from her posture, which was straight and still as always. He knew it the way you know weather is coming before the sky shows any evidence, from something in the quality of the air around her, some subtle pressure change, the particular stillness of a person who has been gathering themselves on the walk between the house and here. She stood in the doorway and told him plainly, in a few short sentences, what had been said on the front porch. The representative's name was Korhen. Sirha offered this detail without inflection, as though it was simply information rather than the name of someone who had been present 2 months ago at the border, one of the formal intermediaries who had walked them down from the mountain and left them at the territorial line with 3 days of food, and the clear implication that they should not trouble anyone further with their existence. Whether Korhen was the same individual or a different one sent in an official capacity, she did not say, and Elias did not ask. He was older, Sirha said, heavy-scaled, formally dressed in the way that communicated institutional authority rather than personal taste. He had stood on the porch with the particular posture of someone who had made this kind of visit before and considered it a professional function rather than a human one, and he had delivered his message with the clean efficiency of someone who had been briefed and was reading from the brief. The coalition, he had explained, had conducted a review. Certain aspects of the autumn decree had been reconsidered in light of subsequent developments. He had used the word developments in a way that suggested he was not going to specify what they were, and there was now a position available for both sisters within the territorial structure if they wished to return. The offer had a condition of timing, before the winter solstice. After the solstice, the position would be filled by other means, and the offer would be considered lapsed. He had said all of this with the tone of someone delivering news they expected to be received as good. Sirha had listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she had asked him with perfect courtesy to wait on the porch, and she had come to find Elias in the workshop. She finished the account and stood in the doorway and waited, her amber eyes steady on his face. The drawer assembly sat half-fitted on the workbench between them. Outside, the cold November air moved through the pines with a sound like distant conversation. Elias set down the plane he was holding. He looked at her, at the quality of her stillness, at the careful neutrality she was maintaining, at the thing underneath the careful neutrality that she would not name but that he could see clearly enough. She was not asking him what to do. She had never once in 2 months asked him what to do. She was not built for that, and he had come to understand it as a function of both her nature and her history, the long conditioning of someone who had learned that waiting for permission was a form of making yourself smaller than you were. What she was doing standing in his doorway was something different. She was telling him first, before deciding, before veil, before anything else. She had come here and told him, and she was waiting not for instruction but for something that didn't have a clean word, something in the territory between witness and permission and acknowledgement. She was telling him because he mattered to what happened next, and they both knew it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He looked at her for a moment, and he thought about all the wrong ways to answer, and then he set them aside. "What do you want to do?" he said. The question arrived and she did not visibly react to it, but he saw something move through her eyes, brief and deep, like something turning over in still water. In her entire life, across a childhood and a young adulthood spent within the rigid hierarchy of clan structure, across years of decrees and assignments and territorial edicts, across every arrangement that had shaped the circumstances of her existence, no one of standing had asked Sirha what she wanted. Wanted had not been a category that applied to her. Things were assigned, things were permitted or forbidden. The preferences of a member of a lesser lineage were not the relevant variable, they had never been the starting point. And here was this man in his unlaced boots and his sawdust-dusted work coat, standing at a half-fitted drawer assembly in a workshop that smelled of pine resin and linseed oil, asking her what she wanted as though it were the obvious and only question. As though it were simply how decisions worked. She held it for a moment, then she said with the care of someone choosing words precisely, Vale would have to decide as well. Of course, he said. Vale was in the armchair when Sirha came back inside. She had the book open across her knees, a thick one, something on the natural history of mountain ecosystems that she had apparently decided was relevant to her current situation. And she looked up when Sirha entered with the expression of someone who reads people as fluently as she read pages, and had already registered that something had shifted in the atmospheric pressure of the morning. Sirha told her. She told it plainly as she had told it to Ilias. The name, the message, the timing, the offer. Vale listened with her book closed in her lap, her pale green eyes on her sister's face, and when Sirha finished she did not immediately respond. She turned and looked out the east window, the one that had been her window from the first morning, the one that delivered the morning light she followed across the floor, that showed her the pines and the ridge behind the cabin and the particular quality of sky that belonged to this specific place at this specific elevation. She looked at it for a long time. Ilias came in from the workshop while she was still looking. He sat at the kitchen table without announcement and did not say anything, and this was the right thing to do. She understood that he was there, that his presence was deliberate and not incidental, and she found that it helped in a way she did not immediately have language for. They left us on a hillside in the rain, Vale said to the window. Her voice was not angry. It was something flatter than angry, something that had passed through anger and come out the other side into a kind of clear, settled assessment. They counted us and found that we didn't add up to enough, and they walked us to a border and left us there. She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at either of them, looking at the middle distance that contained the thought. I don't especially want to go back to people who would do that. A pause. I don't want to go back to people who would do that and then change their minds when they found it convenient, she said. That's a different thing from it not happening. Sirha nodded once, one small definitive movement, decided. She went back to the front porch. Ilias stayed at the table. He heard the front door open and he heard the low and measured sound of Sirha's voice, and he could not hear the words, but he could hear the tone, courteous, final, not unkind, not leaving any useful gap for negotiation. He heard the visitor respond briefly. He heard Sirha again, shorter this time, then silence, then the sound of a car on the gravel road departing. The front door opened and closed. Sirha came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at them for a moment, and then she looked up. Tea, she said, which was not a question and was not addressed to anyone in particular, but Ilias was already up. Vale retrieved her book from the armchair, returned to her seat at the table, and opened it to where she'd left off. She did not read immediately. She sat for a moment with her hand flat on the page, feeling the paper, and then she looked at her sister, and something passed between them that had no witnesses and required none. Then she read. What followed was quiet. Not the quiet of aftermath, not the particular silence of a thing just barely avoided, but the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday morning in November in a cabin on a ridge, where the wood stove ticked and the tea kettle worked toward its task, and outside the pines stood in the cold with their accumulated patience. The representative's visit receded from the morning with the speed of something that had never really had purchase here, had arrived and spoken and been answered and gone, leaving no mark that the day felt obligated to acknowledge. Ilias went back to the workshop after lunch. The drawer assembly was waiting for him with its tolerance issue and its requirement for patience, and he returned to it with the same steady attention, and by late afternoon he had the fit he wanted, smooth and true, running on its slides the way a good drawer should run, frictionless and exact. He held it for a moment before setting it down, ran his thumb along the joint. It was, he thought, good work. It was the kind of work that would outlast him. Someone would open and close that drawer for decades and never think about the man who had spent a Tuesday getting the tolerance right, and that was as it should be. The best work was like that, present and functional and entirely unsentimental about its own existence. He was still thinking about this when he came in for dinner and found the kitchen transformed. Sirha had been cooking since mid-afternoon, apparently, and what she had produced was not the usual careful dinner but something more expansive. Something that had required planning and intention and the deployment of the good dishes that lived in the back of the cabinet. There was no occasion. There had been no announcement of occasion. She had simply decided, in the private way she decided things, that the day warranted something more than ordinary. and she had acted on the decision without fanfare and was now standing at the stove with her back to him in a posture that suggested she was absolutely not doing anything special, and he should not make a thing of it. He sat down, he did not make a thing of it. Vale was already at the table, and she looked up from her book with the expression of someone who had been aware of the cooking for hours and had been exercising considerable patience about not commenting on it prematurely. She had changed out of the flannel shirt, his old green one that had long since become simply hers, into something slightly less informal, which for Vale constituted a quiet acknowledgement that the meal was an occasion, even if no one was calling it that. They ate. The food was extraordinary in the specific and unshowy way that Sirha's food was always extraordinary, precise and warm and considered, each element doing what it was supposed to do. Outside the windows, the November dark came down early over the pines, and the kitchen light held them in its circle with the quality of something both ordinary and sufficient. At some point, Vale said, "I've been thinking about the Lighthouse book." "You finished it last week," Ilias said. "I've been thinking about it since I finished it," she said, with the patient tone of someone addressing a failure of understanding. "That's different from not thinking about it." "What about it?" She considered. The lighthouse keeper at the end, after the ships start coming, she says something. She says that she didn't build the light for the ships that were already coming. She built it for the ones that didn't know there was anywhere to come to. She turned her fork over in her hand. I thought about that for a long time before I understood what she meant. The table held the statement for a moment. "Did you understand it?" Ilias asked. Vale looked at him. "Yes," she said. And then she went back to her food because she had said the thing she meant to say and additional words would have been surplus. Sirha said nothing, but her eyes moved to Ilias briefly, and away, and the line of her shoulders in the kitchen light was as close to unguarded as he had ever seen it. The winter came in fully by December and settled its weight across the ridge with authority. Life continued in its accumulated way, the layering of days, each one building on the ones before, each one adding its small deposit to the structure being built without blueprint or announced intention. Ilias took on more work. Word had spread through the valley in the way that word spread in small places, from the lumber yard to the framers, from the framers to the builders, from the builders to the people who hired builders, that there was a carpenter on the Ridge Road who did good work and quoted honestly and delivered when he said he would. The last quality being apparently rarer than it should have been. More work than he could comfortably handle alone began to arrive. He mentioned this to Sirha in a practical, logistical way. He had 3 inquiries for spring, which was good, but the paperwork and the scheduling and the material ordering were beginning to accumulate in a way that required more administrative attention than he was naturally inclined to give it. She looked at the papers he'd spread on the table. She looked at them the way she looked at everything she was about to reorganize, with a focused, unhurried attention, the kind that took in the whole picture before it began moving any single element. "Give me these," she said. "You don't have to." "I understand that I don't have to," she said without impatience, collecting the papers. "Give me these." By the end of the week, the 3 spring inquiries had become confirmed contracts with deposits. The material orders had been placed at the improved rate she had negotiated, and there was a scheduling system on the kitchen wall that would have done credit to a much larger operation. Garrett, the lumber supplier, had discovered that the discount he'd offered in the autumn apparently had additional room in it, a discovery he seemed to have reached through the same mysterious conversational process as before. Ilias looked at the wall calendar one evening, the neat columns of Sirha's handwriting, the color-coded project timeline, the material delivery windows penciled in with their confirmation numbers, and experienced the specific disorientation of a man who has spent 2 years running his life with string and good intentions, suddenly discovering that organization was a thing that could exist. "This is remarkable," he said. "It's basic logistics," she said from the kitchen. "For you, maybe." A pause. "For anyone if they bother," she said, but her voice had the quality that he had learned to read, the slight warmth behind the brisk delivery, the thing underneath the practical exterior that she expressed by not expressing it. He looked at the calendar for another moment. Then he went to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at her elbow without comment, which was his way of saying what he didn't say, and she picked it up without comment, which was her way of receiving it. Vale's column in the Valley newsletter had begun as an accident. She had written a letter, a long one, detailed and well-argued, about the newsletter's recent piece on regional bird migration, which she felt had been both incomplete and imprecise about the behavioral differences between 2 similar species that wintered in the area. She had sent it without entirely thinking through the consequences, and the newsletter's editor, whose name was Priya and who had been looking for content with actual substance for longer than she would publicly admit, had printed it in full and written Vale a note asking if she had other observations she wanted to share. Vale had other observations. She had a great many other observations, on a great many subjects, and she had been sharing them with books and with the general air of whatever room she happened to be in, and the opportunity to share them with an actual readership was not one she intended to waste. By February she had a column. By spring it had more readers than anything else in the newsletter. Priya called it Field Notes, which Vale found satisfactory. It was about the natural world, mostly the specific and closely observed natural world of the ridge and the valley and the mountain beyond, but it was also in the way of good natural history about larger things, about how systems worked, about patience and adaptation and the logic of long processes, about what you could learn from paying close attention to the world immediately around you. People read it and talked about it, and sometimes called the newsletter office to say so. Priya forwarded these calls to Vale with evident satisfaction. Vale read the messages and was briefly moved by each one, and then returned to her notebook and her window and the close observation of whatever the morning had to show her. In the early weeks of spring, Elias was in the workshop in the late afternoon when he remembered the photograph. He had not planned to think about it. He was sanding a cabinet face, long, even strokes with the grain, the kind of meditative work that kept his hands occupied and left his mind to move at whatever pace it chose, and his mind had been moving through nothing in particular, drifting the way it drifted in the good hours without destination, and then without transition it was there, the photograph on the shelf by the front door. He had put it there years ago, when he and his wife had moved into the cabin together for what was supposed to be the beginning of something rather than, as it turned out, the last good chapter before the accident made chapters a thing the story no longer had. It was a simple photograph, both of them at the coast, one summer squinting into the afternoon sun with the particular unself-consciousness of people who had not known they were being preserved. She was laughing at something he'd said. He was watching her laugh with the expression of a man who has just said something that made the person he loves laugh, and considers this a reasonable ambition for a life. He had not been able to look at it for most of 2 years. He had not taken it down. He had understood, at some level, that taking it down would have been a different kind of surrender than leaving it up. But he had arranged his movements through the front room to avoid the angle from which it was visible, had developed a small unconscious geography of looking away. He set down the sandpaper and went inside. He stood in front of the shelf by the door. The photograph was as it had always been, the two of them, the coast, the summer sun, her laughing, him watching. He stood and looked at it for a long moment, and the grief was there as it always was, the familiar weight of it, the specific gravity that had no seasonal variation and no cure. He was not naive about that. He had never expected the weight to go away. He had only learned, slowly and without any single lesson, to carry it differently. He stood and he looked at the photograph and he thought, I can look at this. Not without pain. Pain was not the variable that had changed. But he could stand here and look at this picture of the two of them at the coast, and the pain was present and real and entirely his, and he was still standing and the world was still continuing. And from the kitchen down the hall came the smell of something being made with attention, and from the front room came the sound of pages turning, and the evidence of this, the specific and improbable evidence of warmth and presence and life continuing in the space around him. Held him in the way that the structure of a good building held, not by removing the weather, but by being solid enough that the weather was not the whole of the experience. He heard the kitchen door swing open, heard the particular rhythm of two people moving around each other in a small space that they had mapped by now to the millimeter, the efficiency of it, the small courtesies that had become automatic, the negotiation of proximity that happened without spoken word. He heard Vale say something, her voice carrying the particular quality it had when she had just thought of something and intended to share it immediately. He heard Sirha's response, short, dry, precise, the tone that somehow amplified whatever Vale had said and gave it additional room to be funny. He heard, in the kitchen at the end of his hallway, in his cabin on a ridge at the end of a road that most maps forgot to include, the ordinary and extraordinary sound of two people being alive. He stood for a moment longer with the photograph. Then carefully with both hands, he straightened it slightly on the shelf, a small and deliberate adjustment, a claim, a decision, and he went to the kitchen. "What are we having?" he asked. Sirha turned from the stove and looked at him over her shoulder. The kitchen light caught her scales at the temple, the amber of her eyes, the expression she wore, practical and warm and entirely itself, not performing anything, not managing anything, simply present. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at him, which was directly and without apology. "Sit down," she said. The words that meant it's almost ready and also you look tired, and also underneath both of those, let someone take care of something for once. You have been taking care of things alone for long enough. He pulled out his chair. Vale materialized from the front room with a book in one hand, and an expression that indicated she had been waiting to tell him something since at least mid-afternoon. She sat down, put the book face down on the table, thought better of it, and put it face up instead so she could see where she'd left off. "The geese are back," she said, "the ones that use the south end of the valley, earlier than last year by 11 days. "What does that mean?" he asked. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said, with the particular brightness of someone who finds uncertainty delightful rather than troubling. "That's what makes it interesting." Sirha set a bowl in front of each of them with the economy of motion that characterized everything she did. No gesture wasted, no flourish added. She sat down across from him and folded her hands briefly, a habit of hers before meals that he had come to recognize as something close to gratitude, not performed for anyone, simply there. The window beside the table showed the evening coming down over the pines, the long blue dusk of early spring, the sky behind the ridge still holding a faint remnant of the day's warmth, the first tentative green beginning to show in the understory below the dark trees. Not yet, but beginning. The way spring always came not with announcement but with accumulation. Day by day, degree by degree, one tentative thing and then another, until one morning you looked out the window and understood that the season had changed while you were attending to other things. Elias picked up his spoon. He sat at the table in the kitchen of his cabin with the photograph straightened on the shelf down the hall, and his wife's absence was present and real and entirely his, and the grief had not gone anywhere and would not go anywhere, and he was not the same man he had been in the years before or even the man he had been when he opened the door on a rainy Monday night and found two strangers on his porch. He was not sure precisely what kind of man he was now. He thought perhaps he was still in the process of finding out. He thought perhaps that was acceptable. He thought perhaps that was, in fact, the only honest relationship a person could have with the question. He thought about a lighthouse built on a coastline where everyone said a lighthouse was unnecessary, and the ships that came that hadn't come before because there was a light. He ate his dinner. Outside, the spring evening continued its patient and unhurried work. The pines stood in their long rows with their deep roots and their accumulated quiet. The geese were back in the south end of the valley, earlier than last year by 11 days, for reasons that were not yet entirely understood, but that someone was paying close attention to. The world, as it had always done, continued. And Elias Crane, sitting at a table made by his own hands in a cabin at the end of a road that most maps forgot, in the warmth and the lamplight and the ordinary extraordinary company of two people who had knocked on his door in the rain and never quite left, Elias Crane smiled. It arrived without announcement and stayed without apology, the way things returned that had always belonged to him. The way the season was returning now to the ridge and the valley below, patient and unhurried and entirely sure of where it was going. He did not note it as significant, it simply was what it was. It was enough, it was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.